Good afternoon and welcome to Engage in Trade Benefits of Foreign Trade Zones. My name is Stella Sheehan and I'm the Deputy Director here at the World Trade Centre. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I am confident that you'll come away with a deeper understanding of this very important trade tool and the many benefits, not least of which, of course, is cost savings that can be realised given the right circumstances. So just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. You will be muted for the duration of the presentation. However, if you wish to ask questions, please do so via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and we will do our best to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the discussion. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Tim Nowak. Tim has led the World Trade Centre for over 15 years now, bringing years of international business experience in Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and South America. He is a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow and a proud Mizzou grad. Over to you, Tim.
Hey, Stella, thank you so much. And it's great to be back here today with all of you. 2023 and the Re-Engage or the Engage in Trade series, and we're certainly looking forward to this discussion. Before we get to our featured speaker, Scott Taylor, in just a little bit, I want to introduce somebody who is a friend to many of you, certainly is a friend to the World Trade Center, a longtime board member of the World Trade Center St. Louis, former president of our board of directors, Mr. Dennis Wilmsmeyer. Dennis is the executive director of America's Central Port, based just across the river over in Illinois, Southwest Illinois. He's been the executive director for, more than 13 years now. Prior to that, he was general manager. He just brings a wealth of experience and knowledge in economic development, transportation, planning. He is involved in many other organizations, both in economic development and in community. He's been very involved from the beginning with the St. Louis Regional Freightway. He's past president and chairman of the Inland Rivers Port and Terminal Association, a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation Marine Transportation Group, just a number of different organizations around the community. His responsibilities day in and day out are managing the operations and the development of the 1,200-acre port and industrial park and business campus, redeveloping a former military logistics center and marketing many of the benefits of river, rail, and road transportation. He also is very involved in overseeing Foreign Trade Zone 31 in Southwest Illinois. And so it's sort of in that vein and that under that umbrella that we've asked Dennis to just join us on the front end to share a little bit of background on that foreign trade zone and the work that is going on over there. So Dennis, I'm going to kick it over to you, and thanks again for joining us.
Tim, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So good to see everybody, and sure appreciate the opportunity here to talk a little bit about Foreign Trade Zone 31. I love the picture that you put up. It makes me look young again. So it has been a few years, a lot of years here at the port, and Foreign Trade Zone has been a great part of what we've done over the years. I really, probably amongst everybody, I am looking more forward to Scott Taylor's presentation than anybody. And you're going to hear a lot of great things from him here just momentarily. But I just want to kind of briefly touch a lot of the things he's going to talk about are available here in Southwestern Illinois as well. So I appreciate Tim and Stella giving me the opportunity to talk about that just a little bit. Stella, would you mind putting up the first slide there, please?
It's just working on that now, Dennis.
Thank you. So we have a lot of great things going on in Southwestern Illinois, one of which is, again, the Foreign Trade Zone. We have several what's called magnet sites, and Scott will probably talk about those here in a little bit as well. So these are sites that are basically pre-designated, ready to go in terms of Foreign Trade Zone operations. Three of those magnet sites, thank you, Stella. Three of those magnet sites, as you can see listed there, are America's Central Port District. So our 1,200 acres of property already is pre-designated as a foreign trade zone site. So companies that come here and locate here are able to use nearly immediately that opportunity for the foreign trade zone. You're going to hear about many of those benefits and why you would want to use a foreign trade zone here from Scott in just a little bit. A second site is Gateway Commerce Center. So all the big logistics, transportation, distribution facilities like the Amazons and Dial and many others take advantage or can take advantage of foreign trade zones. So Gateway Commerce Center is also part of it, as well as Mid-America St. Louis Airport. All three locations are ready to go in terms of foreign trade zone operations. That next slide, please. So we are, again, Southwestern Illinois. We have 12 counties. We went through the Alternative Site Framework program a few years ago and became basically kind of pre-designated for these 12 counties in Illinois. Again, if you have operations in Illinois or both in Illinois and Missouri, you can take advantage of it. Foreign Trade Zone 31 is available for you, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Final slide here, I just want to call to announce on that next slide, please, Stella, is yes, foreignTradeZone31.com. A lot of this may seem very foreign to you, no pun intended, today, if you haven't been in this business or in this industry. We struggled with it for years, trying to explain what a foreign trade zone was to many people. It was in that whole struggle, really, that we came up with an animated video that we think pretty simply and clearly explains that. So if you go to FTZ31.com on your free time after this presentation today, you'll see that video and be able to share that with others. Our administrator here is Miss Robbie Williams. She's available to answer any questions that you have. And again, we hope to even learn more today from Scott as he's talking, and appreciate the opportunity again, Tim. Thank you so much.
Terrific, Dennis. Thank you again for joining us here today. And thank you for all of the work and contributions you've given to this organization in the region. Yeah, don't go look at the video just yet. I want to go check out that video, but we've got to wait until 1 o'clock. Let's wait till after the the presentation. No, we'll look forward to seeing that. So now let's transition over to our guest speaker, Scott Taylor. Scott is somebody that I have known for a number of years. Scott actually was instrumental in setting up St. Louis's foreign trade zone number 102. So just as Dennis talked briefly about the Illinois side, 31. We also have a site here in St. Louis that has also gone through the alternative site framework. We won't get, I'll let Scott get into the details on that, but just a little bit of background for him, and then I'll kick it over to him. Scott Taylor is a member of Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, based out of Kansas City, and he is the leader of the Foreign Trade Zone practice area, where he represents clients across a variety of industries in the area of international trade, customs, and foreign trade zone law. During his career, Taylor has developed and structured more than 550, think about that, 550 FTZ projects, including the aforementioned alternative site framework, special purpose zone, subzones, subzone expansions, general purpose zones and expansions, boundary modifications, and scope determinations. He has extensive experience working with officials at the Department of Commerce, U.S. Customs and Border Protection headquarters, and field offices and congressional offices on Capitol Hill. Taylor holds a JD from University of Missouri, Kansas City, and an MBA from Rockhurst. He's a member of the bar in Missouri and Kansas, and he has just been a terrific resource for St. Louis, for our foreign trade zone, and for a number of companies here that look to better understand the advantages and opportunities with it. So, Scott, thanks for being here with us today. I'm going to kick it over to you and go ahead and turn off my camera.
All right. Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Dennis, for that. That was a good overview of what's available across the river. I think the key thing for context is that you have multiple industrial parks designated, and that's a great thing because those really aren't being approved anymore. They're company by company now. So the fact that you have hundreds of those acres designated that companies can just locate and have the designation already is a big deal. We did the same thing when we set up the ASF that Tim mentioned with North Park in the St. Louis County area. We did that with County Executive Dooley, and that was actually a joint effort with Mayor Slay at the time also to do that application. So it was a lot of fun. Can we go, is it possible, Stella, to do the slide, to bring up the slides from your end? If not, I will.
Yes, I will do that right away, Scott.
Okay, and I'll do a little introduction while you're doing that. As Tim mentioned, 550 zone projects, all 50 states, Puerto Rico, last 24 years. So I've seen quite a bit in the program. I work with the FTZ board in Washington, D.C., which is the approving body for the designation of these zones every day. And then there are 300 customs offices throughout the United States. In St. Louis, it's in St. Louis, so that makes it very convenient. There's one in Kansas City as well that basically splits up the state. And so those offices are key because once a zone is up and running, they have oversight responsibility on an ongoing basis. It's usually once a year spot check unless something comes up. Okay, let's keep rolling through a few of these slides. Some of these are introductory disclaimer. Zone is, we'll jump into what a zone is, what the savings is for companies. I'll give you a few examples and then just briefly talk about the application process if you might have interest. The good news is when County Executive Dooley and Mayor Slay years ago decided to do this, you were one of the first zones in the country to do this new thing called the Alternative Site Framework back in 2008 or 2009, 2010. And it was a big deal because it basically made it a lot easier for any company in the area to get approved. Instead of waiting 6 months for an approval from Washington, D.C., you could get it in 30 days or less and not have to pay an application fee to the U.S. Department of Commerce. There's no fees. And that really made the process streamlined basically for local companies. So a foreign trade zone, though, this concept's been around for hundreds of years in the world, but since 1934 in the United States. This program's restricted access. That means it's a secure facility, whatever the live foreign trade zone is. So you can have designated property, as Dennis mentioned, hundreds of acres, but when a company goes to use the program, their facility is what is activated, and that has to be secure. So that's the restricted access part. Anything within that secure site is outside the U.S. Customs territory, even though it's physically in the U.S. And so that gives you a certain benefit to act like a facility that's overseas, to put you on an even playing field with respect to customs duties or import duties that are owed on imported products. Companies can operate in foreign trade zones to reduce or eliminate customs duties. And you can do a lot of different things in these zones. So, you know, they were originally set up for warehousing distribution at the ports of the United States. The idea was to create value-added activity in the U.S. instead of having, at the time, they were talking about product being shipped from Europe directly to South America, for example. By having the first zone in New York City, zone number 1, the idea was at the port, U.S. workers would do some value-added activity, whether it's repackaging, relabeling, you know, combining things with U.S. workers instead of having it done overseas and bypassing the U.S. economy. This was all set up during the Great Depression. So there's a kind of a history to it to create activity in the U.S. when there was, you know, we really needed it back during the Depression. You can be a manufacturer. The majority of zones these days, you have really two types. You have warehousing. So there are a lot of 3PL warehousing for distribution operations, but there are quite a few manufacturers now in the program. And I'll explain the benefit of manufacturing in the zone, where you can change the duty rate or lower, sometimes wipe out the duty rate or duty that's owed. But the bottom line is the program, it's a Department of Commerce program to help U.S. companies better compete in the global economy by making products here more cost effectively, or storing products here and doing value-added activity such as relabeling, repackaging with U.S. workers. And then hopefully some of that's exported. It doesn't have to be, there's no requirement. Some zones are set up where there's a benefit for distribution in the United States. That's fine. But the bottom line is they create and retain jobs in the US, and that's kind of the standard the Department of Commerce looks at. If we can go to the next slide. The real quick highlights, there are 298 general purpose zones. St. Louis has one of those zones. Dennis's zone is another one of those zones. So there's an organization in each community. Each state has at least one zone. Some states have a lot of zones. In Missouri, for example, I'll show you, I just pulled up Missouri, I didn't pull up Illinois, but there are 3 different zones. There's one in Kansas City, St. Louis, and Springfield. And so geographically, that foreign trade zone organization called the Grantee Organization sponsors any company that wants to get into this program with the Foreign Trade Zones Board. Actually, the numbers go up to 299. We just had the zone in Tyler, Texas approved as zone 299. And you might ask, why do I have 298 up here? It's because back when, the first zone was approved in New York in 1934, number 1. When they got to 13, they skipped over that. Somebody was superstitious back in the 30s or 40s at the Department of Commerce. So there is no zone 13. About 500,000 jobs, 3,400 companies using the program in some capacity in the US, and then about $800 billion in receipts. That put it in context, that's pretty significant. That's up, depending on how you look at the import statistics, that's anywhere from 11 to 20% of imports on an average year. 65% of the product in zones, though, is domestic, because that's one of the benefits of a zone. You can have domestic and foreign imported material, because a lot of manufacturers need to have a certain percentage of imported materials to make their products, but they're sourcing mainly from US suppliers. So you can combine those in a zone, which is good. And you don't pay duty on anything domestic. $123 billion in exports go out of zones, either directly or indirectly. So pretty significant impact on the economy. And I've seen case by case how this does help companies do activities that otherwise the headquarters would have decided, well, do it in China or other countries and bypass the US in certain instances. So let's go to the next slide. And this is just a quick overview for any attorneys on the phone or anybody that's interested in the citations of there's a statute, Foreign Trade Zones Act, passed in 1934, 2 sets of regulations, FTZ board regulations and the customs regulations. Main thing to know here is FTZ board controls kind of the framework of the program, the general framework, and the customs regulations, or the portion of the customs regulations, are really the day-to-day operations regulations that once you're approved, those are definitely you're more focused on using on those on a daily basis. We can keep going. So we pulled up the last annual report. So each of these zones reports once a year to the FTZ board in Washington, DC, and the FTZ board aggregates all the data for Congress once a year. It's usually about a year after everybody reports, because it takes a while to get hundreds of these reports in and compiled. In Missouri, what this is a breakdown of the different types of products that are in zones. And so you have to report kind of different categories. So you can see consumer electronics is about half, chemicals, which could be for pharmaceutical companies, could be for chemical companies, crop protection companies, for example, consumer products, arms, ammunition, machinery, equipment, and other 7%. Missouri has 3 FTZs, as I mentioned, Springfield, Kansas City, and St. Louis, and 12 sites. Dennis mentioned his sites on the Illinois side. There are 12 sites within the state of Missouri, and they range everywhere from Oakley, on the Missouri side. Oakley has a couple of domes. It's less than half an acre, that site. But if you go across the state to Kansas City, we just opened our new airport in Kansas City today. The airport has 10,000 acres designated. That was done back in the 70s. And so, there's a lot of different range in the size of these sites. 13 subzones. Those are individual companies that decided they want to apply just for their standalone manufacturing site or distribution site. And so you've had companies, and this is all public information online on the Department of Commerce website. But companies in the past in St. Louis have been, the GM plant at Wentzville, Bayer Crop Science I worked on many years ago. That I think that's no longer active. Florsheim Shoes had multiple sites for shoe distribution for imported shoes. You company like Orgill that does hardware distribution for a lot of smaller hardware stores throughout the country. And then I mentioned Oakley on, over on the Kansas City side. There are other companies like Kawasaki Motors, and they make motors in Maryville. Quite a few different instances of different types of equipment in different subzones. So there've been some interesting zone projects in the state of Missouri, and here's a listing for the St. Louis zone, number 102. We can keep going. This just gives you a range of activities. So the FTZ board allows companies to report in wide ranges, so there's confidentiality, and then when they aggregate, it's in wide range. So this just gives you an idea of the total merchandise received, exports from the state, shipments, and number of employees working in zone, which is about 3,000 people that work in a foreign trade zone somewhere in the state of Missouri. Okay. These are the 3 zones. And then the other thing to point out is we kind of summarize which zones have sites and subzones and all that, but there's a service area for each of these zones. And so I want to mention that real quick. What that is the streamline option that I mentioned to you, where you can get, if you're a company, you can get approved in 30 days for the designation or less in some cases. That's available in any of the counties within this column on the right called service area in the state. So these are the 3 different zones in their service area. When we set up 102's ASF in St. Louis, it was decided by the county executive and the mayor at the time, let's start with just city of St. Louis County, see how this ASF works, because it was brand new at the time. And so that's how we define the service area. Now, if you're outside of these locations listed under service area, you can still be a foreign trade zone. And some of the subzones that I mentioned are outside of that, but it means you have to have customs in the St. Louis area, for example, agree that they can drive the distance to your facility. So it may be more than 90 minutes, outside of the customs port of entry. But that's something that they can agree to if they feel comfortable they can oversee. A lot of this is done electronically, so there's really typically 1 visit a year by customs. It's not like they're out quite a bit, unless there's a problem. But let's go to the next slide. So I want to give you a quick example with or without a zone. So with and some of you on the call, I know this is going to be very you know this, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same level as far as the basic concepts. So without a zone, you import a product, and you have this is just 1 page out of hundreds of pages of the tariff schedule. Anything that's imported into the country, you have to pay customs duty on, and we've had to do that since George Washington was president. And actually before that, the revenue of the federal government used to be completely funded through these import tariffs. So US Customs has been doing this a long time, and they take it very seriously in protecting the revenue of the federal government, which is this duty that's applied to imported goods. So if you have a good that's worth $100 and there's a tariff rate of, and this is just an example of a page, but let's say 10%, then you have to pay $10 to the US government to import that product. You pay the $100 still to buy it, but you have to pay $10 to the US government to import it. That's a duty. Without a zone, you pay that up front. Wherever it comes in the United States, you have to pay that. LA Long Beach, New Jersey, New York, doesn't matter. So let's go to the next slide. And so you would you declare the product wherever it comes in. Somebody files, a customs broker most likely files a declaration of what the product is, This is what the HTSUS classification number, which I just showed you the example of one page from that. You match it to the most appropriate classification number, which then tells you what the duty rate or the tax. It's like a tax, basically. Think of it. You pay the customs duty up front, and then you can ship it to your facility in the St. Louis area. There's no deferral. You're paying up front and no benefit if you're an importer. If you go to the example of with a zone, same product, same port, don't have to change your schedule. You're just going to do something a little different. You're going to have a foreign trade zone, and you're going to tell customs we have a foreign trade zone in the St. Louis area. So you're able to ship the product in bond. It's a customs bonded carrier, truck driver usually. A lot of them are. That just means it's not actually coming into the U.S. customs territory, even though physically it's in the U.S. It's shipped to the facility in the St. Louis area. It'll be admitted to the foreign trade zone. And that means it's outside the U.S. customs territory still, even though it's physically in the St. Louis area. And while it's held in the foreign trade zone, you still don't pay duty. You could hold it in there 10 years and not pay the import duty that's normally owed. And then if you export that product, you never pay it because it's never actually going into the U.S. customs territory. You're going to ship it back out. So that's the main difference with or without a zone. This is just the structure of the program. I'll just mention the two board members of the Foreign Trade Zones Board are the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Treasury in DC. They never meet. There's no board meeting. The FTZ board staff, about 8 people, handle all the approvals for all 50 states. So they're designated authority. And then they, in turn, there's an original grant to, in this case, the St. Louis County Port Authority, I believe, is the original grantee. Technically, it's the county and the World Trade Center administers it now, but that authority is passed down to the local grantee, which in turn has a contract with any of its companies, and that's an FTZ operations agreement. And so that's how the authority comes from Washington to the company eventually. We can keep going. So you might say which industries would benefit? It's a lot of industries. So the bottom line is you're an importer, you have a customs duty rate that applies. If you export, that's great because your savings will go up, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you don't have to export. There's no requirement that you export. So footwear, apparel, I mentioned Florsheim many years ago. A lot of footwear, most footwear companies have at least one zone because most of them, the footwear is made in Asia and imported into the United States. Aircraft, spacecraft, aircraft may be duty free, but you put electronics on it, electronics and other components that may have duty rates. They're pretty high value, so they can turn into a duty-free product if you add those in a foreign trade zone. Spacecraft, same principle, but the difference is spacecraft is always launched into space, and once it launches into space, it becomes an export. So you can avoid all the duties that would have normally been paid on the imported high-value components. That's not done in Missouri, but that is done in the U.S. Pharmaceutical, chemical, we have some companies on the call in both areas. It's same principle. You have an act, all the major pharmaceutical companies have foreign trade zones, multiple foreign trade zones in many cases. I've worked with many of them. Imported ingredient, active ingredient usually has a 6.5% duty rate. When it's brand new, it's imported from one country, usually that's startup. You can bring that ingredient into a foreign trade zone, make it into a finished pharmaceutical product. It's duty-free. So the duty-free tablet is what will leave your facility in the St. Louis area. You can declare that and say, we want the duty-free rate on all the imported value. And so you can wipe out that 6.5% duty rate by making that in the U.S. foreign trade zone. And the idea is we want you to make it here in Missouri versus making it in Singapore or Ireland, where you're getting some, you could get some deal from the government there, incentive deal. Keep the jobs here, keep the activity here. Medical equipment's another area where you have a lot of high value medical equipment with duty rates that can come in, be sometimes tested, repackaged, added with others. You can assemble it as well. Motor vehicle parts have been in assembly facilities. Most every major automotive facility in the U.S. has a foreign trade zone. All the new facilities, including in the electric area, they're all requiring FTZ status to be competitive, because some of their parts are imported from China still, and that's a lot, especially on vehicle part distribution. So zones are more important than ever in that industry across the board. I'll mention FTZ warehouses at the bottom. During the pandemic, had a flurry of activity for setting up these FTZ warehouses for overflow for a lot of the manufacturers that needed additional space, and also with the supply chain issues. And so this allows a 3PL can quickly get in with this ASF, get approved in 30 days, get activated with customs to store merchandise for other companies. So quite a few of those warehouses being set up, and I think we're going to see a lot more because there's a high demand. I get calls to locate these active warehouses that have 10,000 square feet, 40,000 square feet on a regular basis, and I can tell you it's as soon as they're activated, they fill up. So that's we can keep going there. That's an idea of some of the industries that benefit. The basic savings, though, we talked about a few of the examples. I'll just go back real quick. So duty deferral cash flows for pretty much everybody that has an import duty. You bring it into a foreign trade zone, whatever the product is, don't pay the duty at the port it comes in, hold that money and use it for other business purposes at this point. While it's in your facility, you don't pay anything. So there's a duty deferral. If you sell it in the US, you eventually have to pay the same customs duty, but that's still a deferral. If you export it, the third bullet point, you in most cases can avoid paying anything because it's never coming into the US customs territory. Inverted duty is the second one. That's for manufacturers. I mentioned the chemical example, or the crop protection products sometimes are like pharmaceutical products. A lot of the crop protection companies in some cases have inverted duty, in some cases don't, but they may be exporting a good percentage of what they're making. They have a 6% duty rate. If we could go back real quick, I just want to mention one more. Okay, weekly entry savings. So there's an additional thing. There's the customs duty, and then you have the merchandise processing fee, which is another fee charged for all imports by shipment. That can be over $500 per shipment. The rate keeps changing. But if you have 20 of these shipments a week, you're paying potentially $500 for each of those shipments. With an FTZ, it's the only program that allows you to basically eliminate that or reduce that down to one entry per week and filing that $500 once a week with customs. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars savings for a lot of footwear, apparel, anything with high duty rates that are imported for distribution. We see that a lot. The other one I want to mention here is a trade remedy. All these imports from China that have a 301 duty could be up to another 25%, or 232 for steel, additional percentages, or anti-dumping or countervailing. A zone allows you to defer that. You can't avoid it completely if it's sold in the US, but that can be a really major savings for companies, even if the storage period is only a few months, instead of outlaying that cash up front. Okay, let's keep going. If we can go to the next one. Okay. And then you have, with this ability to get approved in 30 days or less, we have a lot of companies looking at zones where they didn't look before. So you may be a manufacturer, you weren't worried about your finished product staging, so you would declare the product and then send it to a domestic warehouse and be done with it. But there's the ability to prolong the duty savings by adding another warehouse and it's so much easier to do now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So that parts warehouses are things that are being added. Companies didn't have enough savings in the past to do a standalone parts warehouse, but now with the streamlined process, it's a lot easier. Kitting's another one I'll mention. You're a distribution operation that puts finished products together and sells them as a kit. There may be a savings there. The best example is liquor kitting. You can have finished liquor and these nice glasses that are ornamental that come in. Those are all basically made in China these days. They have a 20% duty rate. A lot of liquor is duty free, but if you put it together in a package in the foreign trade zone outside the U.S. customs territory, but physically in the U.S., you haven't paid duty yet. So you're going to package it for these holiday gift packs. And you see a lot of the liquor companies do this, and they do some of this in a foreign trade zone. But you put it together in a gift package, it becomes a different product because it's classified based on the essential character of the main product, which is the duty-free liquor. So it becomes a liquor kit, duty-free. You wipe out that 20% duty rate on glasses. That's just one example. Electronics, dinnerware, it's done in a lot of areas. Surgical kits, for example, medical companies do that as well. Okay, let's keep going. There are some costs of setting up an FTZ. So you've got and these are minimal in this market, a small fee paid to the grantee. It's like a license fee, and then a one-time application fee and activation fee for just reviewing documents before they're filed. And then annual cost of the operator's bond. There is an operator, a 301 bond for all FTZs. Minimum face amount's $50,000. The cost of that's $500 a year to maintain. IT expense for your tracking your inventory. You have to be able to track the HTS US classification, duty rate, country of origin, a few items like that. So there a lot of times has to be a modification to what you already do, unless you already have that being tracked for other purposes. And then allocation of FTZ administrator salaries. Most companies these days, with technology what it is, more robust than ever, take an existing employee and give them a new FTZ title on top of 2 or 3 other titles, and that's usually what happens with most zones, unless it's a very large complex operation that there might be a new hire. And then you should always budget in oversight, audit, and training, kind of ongoing basis. Our law firm helps out with that, and we can do that, but always plan on doing that at least the first couple of years to get things off to a good start. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, I'm going to go through these very quickly, and just want to check time. On the alternative site framework, this is the thing that we put in place back several years ago that allow basically, and 90% of zones have it now. So St. Louis was kind of on the cutting edge when they did it, but others have followed. And so most major markets, if you're competing for other, with other markets, have this in some form. But what it does is allow the 30-day approval. Let's keep going. There's no public comments. The other thing I didn't mention, I mentioned no fee. That's the advantage. You can just file it with the Department of Commerce with the St. Louis Foreign Trade Zone cover letter and sponsorship. But that's one major difference. If you're in this service area, no public comments. So everything's kind of under the radar, because we did an original public comment period when we did the original application, which covered the entire territory. If you're outside of that territory, there is a public comment period, and that doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be an issue. People don't generally, for subzones for distribution, have any issue. It's really when you get into production, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay. Key terms and real quick, service area we've talked about. If you're in, 30-day approval. If you're out, a little bit longer, 3 to 5 months. In this case, on the Missouri side, it's the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County right now, the service area. And then you can still apply outside. It's not, I want to make that clear. So that's still a possibility. Just, it's going to take longer. You have to pay that up to $6,500 just to file it with the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's an old fee dating back decades that they still have in the regulations. Okay, let's keep going. And what you would apply for these days, there's a few kinds of sites. So, Dennis mentioned magnet sites. He has in his zone multiple magnet sites. North Park is the example in St. Louis, Kansas City International in Kansas City. And we also have the Hunt Underground, which are the underground storage designated for general storage. Those are all magnet sites. And the idea is that they attract companies to the site. It's more than just about one company. Those aren't really being applied for anymore. Because of this ASF, that would still take 6 to 12 months to do. They've made the standard a little higher. So subzones or usage-driven sites are really what companies are doing to establish a zone just for their facility. And with this 30-day approval process, they've made it very easy. There are sunset limits. 3 years from the date you get approved, you have to turn it on or activate with customs. We'll talk about that very briefly. For magnet sites, it's 5 years. Somebody has to be activated somewhere. That's all. Those are the key terms. Let's keep going. So what do you need to do to file for a subzone or usage-driven site under this ASF, this 30-day approval process? It's this simple. I just want you to see, you need, they want to know where the address is, how many acres, what's going to happen in the building, what type of, land and zoning. Zoning is important because the FTZ board doesn't want to approve agriculturally zoned property because that's not ready yet for manufacturing or warehousing. And then retail is the other one. There's a retail prohibition for retail and foreign trade zones. Square footage of the building space, they want to know, kind of what the layout is. And then if you can keep going, there's a site plan to the next slide. The site plan will be, you have a red line around the boundary of whether it's a whole manufacturing campus or just one warehouse building. Whatever's within that red line will be designated a foreign trade zone. So it's important to get that right and make sure you include all your property. The property owner, they want to know who the name of the property owner is, but we don't have to have a letter from the property owner necessarily. You can, as an operator, say we have the right to do this if you're leasing, because there are no leases that prohibit a company from being an FTZ. So that was kind of a way they set that up, because many years ago we had to get property owner letters that were maybe a sentence or two long. And I can tell you, I had one example where I negotiated with an attorney from New York, probably about a month or two on those 2 sentences. I mean, it was almost ridiculous. And the cost of that and time that the company lost because they had to have that technical item, the FTZ board finally said, if we're going to streamline the program, we're going to allow a company to attest that they have the right to use the property now, because the status does not record on the property. So there's no property owner right per se. Okay. So that's to get the warehousing distribution approval. That's one application. If you're a manufacturer, you have to go a step further, because when you get into manufacturing, the FTZ board's allowing you to change duty rates on products. I mentioned the pharmaceutical example where it goes from 6.5% to duty-free tablets. Because they're allowing you to reduce completely or lower the duty rate on products, they want to know a little bit more detail on what you're actually doing, what's being imported and what's going out, and the duty rates involved. So we have to file an FTZ production notification. If we can go to the next slide. There are 356 of these active FTZs that produce products, or there are hundreds more that are just pure warehousing and distribution. But each of these companies have been approved for a specific scope of authority, where they actually list, this is what we import, basic product description, not technical description. the tariff schedule number that I mentioned to you, and then the duty rate for each item. And so you might have a list of 20 imported items, and then you make one product at the end of that process within the facility. There's a second list where you list what you're making. You have to mention whether any of these imported parts are subject to these 301 duties from China, Section 232 duties on steel, or any other anti-dumping or countervailing duty. If they are, you have to admit those in privileged foreign status. And that's why you mention it, because that means you basically can't get the inverted duty savings for that particular part or product, imported material, because you can't avoid a U.S. government trade policy law by using the FTZ program. You can't get around it, but you can defer while it's held in the foreign trade zone, because that's outside the U.S. customs territory. So that's this process has been completely streamlined. If you talk to anybody, including, I was looking at the list of subzones I worked on years ago, that manufacture, many of them went through the older process, which could have been 6 to 12 months. The application was 2 or 3 inches of information and attachments and documents, and we'd have to go into Washington and file 9 hard copies of these binders. It was quite a process, meet with the congressional members. They've streamlined it down to a few pages to say, this is what we really need to know. And then there's a public comment period. So if somebody in the industry is concerned about what the company's doing, they have the ability to file a comment and open that discussion. 90% of these, 95, have no comments, because if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, most of your competitors have already done this. It's hard to say that I have a zone, this company shouldn't be allowed to have a zone. And many of the other industries I mentioned have multiple companies already in, so the industry's been vetted. It's when you get into these new areas, sometimes that's where the issue can come up, or a supplier, a domestic supplier, potentially might have an issue. So the process works well, though. If you can go to the next slide, you file this short application. It's a 40-day public comment period. It'll be processed through within 4 months. Like I said, 95% of these have no comment, and so they're approved right at 120 days. Like, we get an email approval. It's automatically 120 days. If somebody files a negative comment, though, there's no rebuttal option, because this is so streamlined that they basically will say, we're not approving you, but you have to go to the next step, which is a full-blown production application. If you can go to the next slide, that is what we used to have to do when I mentioned that 3-inch binder, provide a lot of detail. So if a company goes into that, there is a lot more about your competitors, the industry we have to provide, but they're very specific questions, about 36 questions now. So it's not, impossible to get through that process if you get to it. But usually we know, if you've done this enough, you kind of know which areas that's going to come up with. Silica gel. If you're cutting textiles, you're probably going to have a textile association comment in the first step, and then you'll have to try to work through. But there have been companies in the furniture industry, for example, have represented smaller family-owned businesses that cut certain textiles that are no longer made in the U.S. To make furniture. And most of their competitors are larger companies that are importing the finished furniture from China. So they're trying to keep the jobs here in the Midwest. And so there are some exceptions to these. So but if you have opposition, we can help you work through that. That's no problem. So let's keep going. And then the last step of this, real briefly, is the activation portion. So you get the designation for those 2 applications from the FTZ board in Washington, D.C. Then you have, at the same time, you can start the activation process with local U.S. Customs and Border Protection in St. Louis. There's because the end result is you want an activation approval letter from the St. Louis Customs Office saying you're ready to start using the zone. You have the designation from DC, an authority, and they help you turn this on live, basically. Let's go to the next thing, and I'm going to go through this very briefly. Application for activation, that's a letter. There is no actual application. 4 or 5 pages of detail. We kind of done this enough. We have kind of a template to start with, but has several exhibits or background checks, site plan of what you're activating. So you might designate 100 acres, but only activate 1 building. You're allowed to do that. Keep going. Next slide. And then you have to get a concurrence from the St. Louis Foreign Trade Zone to activate, which means you probably signed an FTZ operations agreement or contract already. Operations manual that describes your procedures. Customs will come out and do a cargo security survey. We try to be out there and help with that and do a walkthrough before that to identify anything. And then you request specific authorities, operation. I won't get into all those now, but you have to know what to request and request it to get approved in the final approval. Go ahead. And so that's what a foreign trade zone is, what the savings are for companies. Some examples in Missouri, the application process, 1 or 2 applications. There's always one at the Department of Commerce, unless if you locate, like Dennis said at the beginning, within a magnet site that's already approved, designated, you're in a foreign trade zone, even though it's not in your name, it's in an industrial park name. Then you can go to that last step, the activation step with customs. So that's kind of the quick overview. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Scott. I feel like we could go on and on. There's so much information there.
Oh,
and who knew space was a new export market for us? So we're gonna have to investigate that. We might have some issues with quality of life there. So we do have a few questions coming in.
Right.
So Joylyn and Kimberly, I'm kind of going to combine these two. So Joylyn is asking, is there a quota of number or value of imports that a business would need to do to meet criteria for this?
That's a great question. And so I get that question, what is the minimum savings amount? And I can tell you it's completely different with each industry. So I'll be happy to talk with anybody offline, one-on-one with that. You can email me and we can set up a call or just do it by email. But it can be all over the place. You can have a very large manufacturing plant that only saves $100,000, $200,000 a year. Or you could have a small closet, like in New York in the Diamond District. There's a jewelry operation, and it might be a closet, but they're saving a lot of money because they're bringing products in from Europe, maybe displaying them, and then if they sell them, they make entry on them. But if they don't, they ship them back overseas and don't pay duty. So general warehouses may set up to attract business. So there may be no savings or no volume on day one. So it really depends on the company. If you're a manufacturer, though, I think you'd want to save at least $50,000 to $100,000 a year if you're manufacturing your own product, because there are some costs for setup and ongoing costs.
And then a question from Kimberly, is there a similar question, maybe an extension of the last one? Is there a formula or decision tree that a company can use to determine whether they would benefit from establishing or using an FTZ? There's we do, part of what we do, and having done 550 of these, is work with companies to create a feasibility up front. We want to make sure there's savings. And I can tell you, I know you want to be impartial as the World Trade Center. So there are a lot of savings calculators online by different parties where you can go in and plug in what your volumes are. That'll give you a ballpark, but it's better to kind of do it in a little more detail than that sometimes if it's a new operation. Absolutely. All right. And this is no name given for this one, but if I import a raw material into the US and that raw material is processed at a toller facility to be exported afterwards, can I still utilize the FTZ to import and send it to the toller for production?
Can you repeat that again? Did you say toller?
Toller, yes. I think
toll
that sounds
processing?
like that. Yes.
Okay.
I think that's the reference there. So if I import raw material into the US and that raw material is processed at a toller facility to be exported afterwards, can I still utilize the FTZ to import it and send it to the toller for production?
Yeah, I mean, you could do it a couple of ways. If it's two separate facilities, your facility and the toll processing facility, if you really wanted to capture the savings, you'd have both facilities, and there are quite a few toll processors in the, especially in the pharmaceutical area. We've added quite a few in the last 5 years, but chemical area, other areas as well. If you only, if the company's asking if they only set up a foreign trade zone at their facility, they're welcome to do that and defer the duty. But once they send it to a non-FTZ in the U.S., then they have to pay duty and declare it. So the savings will be limited in that case. But if they made both facilities an FTZ, which companies do, and that product's exported back out of the U.S., then they can avoid customs duty altogether.
And I think we have time to squash in this one last one. Are there magnet sites in St. Louis, and how do we find that out? I think you alluded to that earlier, but just another question.
Yeah. The North Park is the main one. There used to be several. When we did the ASF, we set up several, and the problem is if nobody uses them within 5 years, they sunset. So we had quite a few around Lambert and other areas, and there just wasn't any immediate use. So the only one on the Missouri side is North Park. That's about 492 acres. And then Dennis mentioned on the Illinois side, he has 3 large sites, which is great. And then other than that, you have to go all the way to Kansas City International and Hunt Underground, and go Chiefs, by the way, I should mention that. And then Springfield, I think they might have 1 or 2, but there aren't that many. I mean, yeah.
And good to know that we were cutting edge at the time. So that's good to know, Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we had I mentioned this just because it was kind of cool. I suggested, and they did it. I said, the county and the city didn't work on too many projects collaboratively, but I said, this is really a great one because you're going to help businesses in both the city and the county. And so we did a signing ceremony for the approval in St. Louis. It was kind of one of the few times we've done that in the program. So it was pretty cool with the mayor and county executive taking part in it. So
fantastic. And of course, that fills in very nicely with the World Trade Center's remit as well. We work in the city and the county as well.
That's
right.
Well,
thank you so much, Scott. That was a wealth of information in 1 hour. So we really appreciate it. Just a reminder to everyone, if you are interested, we're always looking for new users of the zone. If you are interested, my colleague Sean Mullins, who is our Foreign Direct Investment Director here, is our contact, and we can help with Scott's help. Of course, we can help you evaluate the advantages for your company. So thank you again, Scott, and to Dennis as well. That was, as I said, very, very informative. And thank you so much to our attendees for joining us this afternoon. Don't forget to join us next month for International Women's Day. That's on March 8th. And we hope to see you very soon for that and other programs. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.